The knock was barely more than a whisper against the wood, a hesitant tapping that might have been the wind had he not been listening so hard to the silence inside his own chest. He rose from the chair by the hearth, joints aching with the kind of weariness that comes from years of labor and too many nights counting debts instead of sheep. When he pulled open the cabin door, the dying light of evening caught her. Small, barefoot, dressed the color of ash and dust. She clutched a ragged doll as if it were all the world had left her. Her eyes, wide and dry, lifted to his. "Can you buy my doll?" she whispered, voice tremoring like a candle flame in draught. "My 3 years brother hasn't eaten in 3 days." He froze. Words deserted him, the way they often did since grief hollowed him out. He saw the boy then, a tiny figure half hidden behind her, cheeks sunken, hair matted by neglect. The child's silence spoke louder than pleading ever could. The rancher's throat worked as though he might answer, but only the creak of the door hinge filled the space between them. His cabin smelled of smoke and thin stew. He had half a loaf of bread left on the shelf, the last of the flour gone days ago. He had been rationing it with the grim patience of a man alone. But standing in the threshold, gazing at the children, the arithmetic of hunger changed its meaning. Her fingers tightened around the doll's limp body, stuffing leaking through a seam at the shoulder. "Mama said a good man don't turn away a child." The rancher let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. His voice, when it came, was low and roughened by disuse. "A man with nothing still has bread to share." The words sounded borrowed, as though some better soul had placed them on his tongue. The girl blinked, as if testing whether he spoke truth. Her brother swayed on his thin legs. The rancher reached out, hesitated, then stepped aside. The girl led her brother in, their bare feet padding softly against the worn plank floor. He closed the door behind them, shutting out the orange rim of sunset. Inside, shadows stretched long. The hearth fire was modest, but it gave enough glow to show the children's faces, pale as parchment, eyes too large for their years. He set them near the warmth, then pulled the loaf down from the shelf. His hands trembled slightly as he broke it. Half he kept for tomorrow. The rest he laid on a tin plate before them. The boy did not wait. He seized a piece and gnawed, small teeth desperate. The girl paused, doll still tucked beneath her arm, and whispered, "Thank you, sir." He studied her a moment longer. Dirt smudged her cheeks. A ribbon once pink tied back her hair, now frayed to gray threads. She carried herself with the gravity of someone who had borne too much, too young. He crouched, resting one hand against his knee. "What's your name, child?" She lowered her gaze. "Mary." She motioned to the boy. "This is Samuel. He don't talk much." The rancher nodded, though her words struck something inside him, a reminder of his own silence after burying his wife, how he'd gone months without speaking to anyone but cattle. He let the memory drift back into shadow. As they ate, he watched the way Mary broke the bread in two, passing the larger piece to her brother. He thought of scripture the preacher used to say, words that lingered like half-forgotten songs. "Whoever saves one life, it is as if he has saved all mankind." The rancher had not set foot in church for near a year, but tonight those words seemed to sit in the rafters above him. When the children's chewing slowed, he fetched the kettle from the stove, poured them each a cup of thin broth. Mary sipped with both hands on the tin cup, her doll pressed awkwardly to her chest. He wondered at that doll, stitched by some mother's hand long ago, a relic of care in days when laughter still filled their home. Samuel's head soon drooped with exhaustion. Mary brushed his hair back, rocking him against her shoulder. The rancher set an old quilt on the floor near the hearth, and she lowered him gently down. He curled into the fabric as if it were a cradle. Mary remained awake, her small figure lit by flickering fire. She glanced at him with a wariness that belied her gratitude. "Will you send us away in the morning?" The rancher leaned against the doorframe, shadows hiding most of his face. His heart tightened at her question, and for a moment he nearly confessed the truth, that he had nothing to give beyond what they'd eaten, that tomorrow held no promise. But instead he said, voice steady, "I don't send children away from fire when night is cold." Her eyes softened, some tension uncoiling in her small shoulders. She lay down beside her brother, doll tucked between them. Sleep came quickly, heavy as stone after hunger's long vigil. The rancher stood watching, the fire crackling like memory itself. The room seemed different with their presence, not less lonely, but strangely alive. He walked to the window, where the last sliver of daylight surrendered to night. Out in the distance, coyotes cried, sharp against the hush. He whispered, more to the dark than to himself, "Lord, don't let me fail them." As the wind pressed its palm against the cabin walls, he felt the weight of what had begun. Not charity, not chance, but something heavier, a responsibility that would mark every choice from this night forward. And though his larder was bare, his soul stirred with a hunger of its own, one that would not let him turn back. The cabin smelled of damp wood and smoke, the sort of scent that clings to the clothes of men who live too long alone. Morning light filtered through the thin curtains, casting pale bands across the floor where Mary lay curled beside her brother. The quilt covered them both, though Samuel had turned half onto his sister's arm, his tiny hand clutching the frayed doll between them as if he might lose it to the wind. The rancher watched in silence from his chair, his elbows on his knees, his mind restless despite the quiet. He had not slept, not truly. He had kept the fire alive through the night, not for warmth alone, but for the strange fear that if it burned out, the children might vanish like smoke. When Mary stirred, she blinked at the rafters above, disoriented. Then she sat up, smoothing Samuel's hair with a tenderness learned from absence. The rancher set his coffee tin aside. "You sleep any?" he asked, his voice still gravel from silence. "A little." She shifted closer to her brother, who breathed slow, his lips cracked. "He sleeps better when it's warm." The rancher nodded, though he had no balm for cracked lips but water from the pump. He filled a cup and set it near her. She helped Samuel drink when he woke, steadying his head with patient hands. Watching her, the rancher felt something twist in his chest, too heavy for pity, too raw for comfort. When Samuel settled again, Mary drew the doll into her lap. She stroked its patched dress, eyes fixed on the faded fabric. The rancher, reluctant to break her quiet, asked low, "Where's your mama now?" Mary hesitated, fingers still moving over the doll. "She got sick." Her words came like stones dropped one by one. "Coughed until she couldn't get up no more. She told us to go find help. Said maybe somebody would take us in." She swallowed hard, gaze still fixed downward. "Nobody would." The rancher felt the weight of those words, heavier than any cattle yoke. He thought of nights he had walked into town and kept his head low, knowing the eyes that judged a man who failed to keep his ranch thriving. What must it be for a child to knock on doors only to be turned away? "What about your pa?" he asked gently. Mary's hands stilled on the doll. Her voice dropped to a near whisper. "Gone before Samuel could walk. Folks said he rode off when the drinking took him. Mama never spoke his name again." The rancher leaned back, chair creaking under him. He had known men like that, who let the bottle carry them away faster than the river. He himself had drowned in grief a time or two, though whiskey had not been his poison. His silence lengthened, until Mary looked up, perhaps fearing his judgment. "I ain't got much," he said finally. "But you're safe here a while." Her small shoulders lowered, some invisible weight shifting, though not gone. She clutched the doll tighter, as if that promise might slip away. He rose, crossing to the shelf where an old tin of beans sat beside the empty flour sack. With careful hands, he poured half into a pot and set it on the stove. "It ain't a feast," he muttered, "but it'll do." Mary watched the beans simmer, the faint hiss filling the silence. After a while she asked, "Why do you live out here alone?" The rancher's hand stilled on the spoon. He had not spoken her name yet, though it had already rooted itself in him. He thought of the grave on the hill behind the cabin, marked by a simple stone. "My wife passed," he said, voice low. "No children came after. So it's just me now." Mary's gaze softened. She seemed older than her 6 years as she whispered, "Mama said people always leave. But she told me to keep Samuel close." Her hand smoothed her brother's hair again. "I ain't letting him go." Something in the way she said it pierced him deeper than he cared to show. He stirred the pot, fighting the urge to look at the grave in his mind. They ate quietly when the beans were ready. Samuel's appetite was small but steady, his cheeks flushed with a little color. Mary ate slowly, dividing her portion, slipping more onto her brother's plate when she thought the rancher wasn't looking. He noticed but said nothing, letting her guard remain intact. Afterward, she carried the dishes to the basin without being asked. The sight startled him. Her small figure standing on tiptoe, rinsing tin plates with the seriousness of a grown woman. She reminded him of the way his wife used to hum while she worked, only Mary carried silence instead of song. When the chores were done, he stepped outside to chop wood. Mary followed, doll under her arm, Samuel trailing behind. The morning was crisp, the sky pale as washed linen. He swung the axe into the log, the crack splitting the silence. Samuel jumped at the sound, hiding behind Mary's skirts. She rested a hand on his head, steadying him. "You ain't afraid of work?" the rancher asked her. She shook her head. "Mama said work keeps the heart from breaking." He paused mid-swing, staring at her thin frame, the doll pressed tight in her arms. The words echoed in his chest like a bell struck deep. As the sun climbed higher, he stacked the wood, his thoughts heavy. He knew the townsfolk. They would not look kindly on him taking in strays. They already called him unlucky, cursed by God, a man who failed to prosper where others did. To harbor 2 children with no kin, no dowry, no place, it would stir tongues sharper than knives. That night, when the children settled again by the hearth, he lingered by the window. The stars stretched endless above, cold and bright. Behind him, Mary whispered to Samuel, voice soft as prayer, "He won't send us away. I know it." The rancher turned from the window, his jaw tight. The words had been meant to soothe her brother, but they struck him too. He carried them into the silence of his own heart, where fear and hope warred like rival fires. And when sleep finally came to the cabin, he sat awake still, staring at the dying glow of the coals, knowing the question she had asked, why he lived alone, was one he might no longer answer the same way again. The road into town was long with dust, the kind that clung to boots and settled in throats. The rancher walked steady, a sack slung over his shoulder that held the last silver spur he meant to trade. Beside him, Mary carried her doll close, the frayed ribbon catching the morning light, while Samuel clutched his sister's free hand. The children's feet scuffed in the dirt, their small bodies too light, too frail, but their eyes fixed forward as if the town itself might hold a kind of promise. By the time they reached Main Street, the sun was high and the town alive with movement, wagons creaking, horses stamping, women gossiping in clusters by the mercantile. The rancher felt the weight of eyes before he saw them, the slow turn of heads, the whispers that rose and fell like dry leaves. A man who couldn't keep his ranch whole had brought strays into his life, and now he paraded them down the street. He kept his jaw tight, his steps unbroken, but he heard enough. "Charity's fool," one voice muttered. "Can't feed himself, let alone orphans." Always new sorrow clung to him. The words slid like knives across his back. He did not answer, for silence had always been his shield, but he knew the children heard. Mary's hand tightened around Samuel's, her chin dipping though she tried to hold it high. At the mercantile, he laid the silver spur on the counter. The storekeep eyed it, then the children, and frowned. "This'll fetch you a sack of flour, no more. Hard times ain't eased by taking on mouths you can't fill." The rancher's gaze held steady. "Flour will do." His voice carried no anger, only the low rumble of a man unwilling to bend. Mary stood close, her doll pressed against her chest, eyes darting toward the rows of jars and barrels. He saw her looking at the apples in a basket near the window. Small, bruised, but red all the same. He wished he had something left to trade for them, but the spur was all. He gathered the flour into his sack and nodded. As they stepped out, the church bell began to toll, calling folks to the small clapboard building at the far end of the street. The rancher might have turned home, but Mary tugged gently at his sleeve. "Can we sit inside, just a little? Mama used to." Her voice carried no demand, only longing. He hesitated, then nodded. They joined the slow procession filing in, sliding into a back pew. The preacher's voice soon filled the space, gravelly but firm. "Let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these." The words fell heavy, echoing against walls that had too often heard judgment instead of mercy. The rancher bowed his head, though his thoughts wandered to the two children beside him, their small hands folded clumsily, their lashes lowered. After the service, the congregation spilled out into sunlight. Whispers followed close. One woman's voice, sharp and thin, sliced the air. "That girl's dress is near rags. Shame to bring her in here like that." Mary froze, shoulders tightening. Samuel pressed closer to her side. The rancher turned, his eyes finding the woman. He said nothing, but his stillness carried weight, his silence louder than retort. Mary looked up at him then, searching, and for the first time she saw not just a man with weary eyes, but a wall between her and the scorn of others. On the way out of town, she finally spoke. "Why do they look at us so mean?" Her voice quivered, more from confusion than fear. He stopped on the road's edge, crouching so his gaze met hers. Dust swirled in the wind around them. "Sometimes folks forget they were hungry once too," he said quietly. "Don't you forget." His hand, rough and scarred, hovered as if to rest on her shoulder, but he let it fall, not wishing to startle her. Samuel tugged at his sister's skirt, pointing at the flour sack. The rancher lifted it easily, slinging it over his shoulder again. They walked on, the children between him and the world, the sun dipping westward. By the time they reached the edge of his land, the horizon glowed with the burn of evening. The flour was heavier than it should have been, but not for the weight of grain. It was the burden of eyes, of whispers, of a town already ready to carve judgment into his name. He knew what they would say, a man doomed to fail, dragging innocence with him. Back at the cabin, he set the flour on the shelf. The children collapsed near the hearth, Samuel asleep within moments, Mary's hand still locked on the doll. The rancher stood at the door, looking out toward the line of hills swallowed by shadow. He felt the truth pressing in, the road ahead would not ease. He would not only have to feed them, but shield them from the cruel arithmetic of a town that measured worth by coin and crop. He whispered into the dusk, words that tasted more like vow than prayer. "So long as I've breath, they won't go hungry again." And though the night seemed to rise heavy, he could not shake the sense that this promise would cost him more than he yet understood. The days settled into a rhythm neither expected. Morning light spilled across the cabin floorboards, and Mary rose early, tying her frayed ribbon as though it were a crown. She tended to Samuel with small, practiced motions, a damp cloth on his face, half a biscuit in his hand, while the rancher stepped outside to split wood or check the fence line. It was strange, how quickly the silence in his cabin filled with sound. Samuel's soft hums, Mary's whispering stories to her doll, even the scrape of tin cups at the table, it all changed the air, made it less hollow. One afternoon, he found Mary perched on a stool too tall for her, sleeves rolled as she mended a tear in one of his shirts. Her stitches were crooked, the thread uneven, but the sight stilled him. She looked up, startled. "Mama showed me how," she said, as if afraid he might scold. He shook his head, voice gentle. "Looks finer than anything I'd sew." And it was true. He had never touched a needle since his wife's passing. Seeing Mary bent over the cloth felt like a fragment of something returned. Samuel followed him often, shadow small but determined. When the rancher carried water from the pump, the boy toddled beside him, gripping the bucket's rim as though his tiny strength could help. When he repaired the fence, Samuel crouched in the dirt, imitating the motions with sticks. The rancher said little, but he caught himself slowing his steps so the boy could keep pace. One evening, the three of them sat by the hearth after supper. The fire's glow flickered over Mary's face as she hugged her doll close. The rancher noticed the missing button eye again, the way it made the toy seem wounded. Quietly, he fetched an old tin box from the shelf, rummaged until he found a spare button. His hands were clumsy, needle-thick between fingers used to rope and reins, but he stitched until the doll's eyes were whole once more. When he handed it back, Mary blinked hard. "You fixed her." Her voice trembled, as though something inside her cracked open. "Now she can see again." He only nodded, but the words stayed with him long after the fire dimmed. The weather shifted. A storm rolled over the hills one night, wind rattling the cabin walls, rain pounding the roof. Samuel whimpered in his sleep, and Mary pressed close, whispering comfort. The rancher sat awake, lamp lit, watching the water slip beneath the doorframe. His supplies were thinning faster than planned. Every meal stretched thinner, every portion divided with care. Yet he found himself unwilling to eat more than they did. Hunger had become less sharp, dulled by the sight of children resting safe within reach. The next morning, the storm's aftermath lay heavy. Fallen branches scattered the yard, and the fence leaned from the weight of the wind. He worked long hours to repair it, sweat streaking his shirt despite the chill. Mary appeared at his side, clutching a hammer too big for her hands. "I can help." He took it from her gently. "This work's heavy." Her chin lifted. "Mama said work keeps the heart from breaking." The word struck him again, the echo of her mother's teaching. He handed her smaller nails, guiding her where to place them. Together, they set the fence straight. Samuel watched from the grass, clapping when the board held. For a moment, laughter cut through the weariness, startling in its brightness. That night, as they ate what little stew he could manage from beans and scraps, Mary looked across the table, her voice soft but certain. "You don't live alone anymore." The rancher's spoon stilled. He wanted to answer, but the words tangled in his throat. He only gave a small nod, his gaze lowered, though warmth flickered through the hollow places in his chest. Still, the weight of the town pressed on him. He thought of their stares, the whispers about foolish charity, and knew that sooner or later judgment would reach his door. But within the cabin, trust was stitching itself quietly, thread by thread, no louder than a doll's repaired eye. When the children drifted to sleep that night, the rancher lingered by the lamp. The flame trembled, throwing shadows across the walls. He whispered into the silence, half prayer, half vow. "So long as they're under this roof, they'll not be cast out again." Yet as he closed the lamp's glass and the cabin darkened, a thought pressed against him harder than hunger. The town would not forgive what it did not understand. And when their eyes turned sharper, he would have to stand against them, not with words, but with a quiet strength the children already believed he carried. The summons came with the sound of boots on his porch. A neighbor, hat low, voice curt, told him there was talk at the town hall. Folks wanted answers. Why he was keeping those children, how he meant to feed them when he could barely keep his own land alive. The rancher said nothing, only nodded, though Mary's hand clutched his sleeve as she listened from the doorway. Samuel peeked from behind her, wide-eyed and silent. By dusk he walked the dusty road toward town, the children at his side. The air felt heavy, a storm without rain. Lamps glowed in windows, voices gathering ahead. When they reached the hall, the crowd was thick, faces he'd known for years, some hard with suspicion, some merely curious. The preacher stood near the front, Bible in hand, lines of concern carved deep across his brow. The rancher guided Mary and Samuel inside. Murmurs rippled through the room. "There he is. Bringing them here too? Fool notion." The words cut, but he kept his shoulders squared, jaw set. Mary squeezed Samuel's hand, the doll pressed tight against her chest. The storekeep who'd traded flour stepped forward. "We all know times are lean. You can't feed yourself, much less strays. Better they be turned over to someone who can." The rancher's silence stretched. He had lived with few words so long they had become his armor, but in that moment the weight of his silence was mistaken for weakness. Voices rose, each harsher than the last. "He'll drag them down with him. Unfit, same as he's always been." Mary's breath quickened. She looked up at him, searching his face, waiting for him to speak. But the rancher's eyes, steady though pained, remained fixed ahead. The room closed in, judgment pressing from all sides. Then Mary stepped forward. Her small voice, trembling but clear, pierced the noise. "He gave us bread when no one else would." The crowd stilled. Her hands tightened around the doll as she drew in a shaking breath. "Mama said the Lord sees who breaks bread." The hall fell to silence, save the soft creak of floorboards. The preacher lowered his Bible slowly, his gaze on the girl. A verse rose from his lips, quiet but carrying. "I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me." A murmur stirred again, softer this time, tinged with shame. An old woman near the back shifted her basket forward, pulling out a small loaf of bread. She set it on the table. Another followed, potatoes, a jar of beans. One by one, others stepped forward, laying down what they could spare. The harshness in the room ebbed, replaced by a strange stillness. The rancher's throat ached, though he said nothing. He looked at Mary, her chin lifted though her lip trembled. Samuel clung to her hand, eyes wide as though witnessing something too large to name. The preacher nodded once, slow and deliberate, as if to mark the moment in heaven's ledger. The storekeep muttered, but his voice held less certainty now. "A fool's burden," he said, though no one answered. The rancher gathered the children close, the offerings on the table casting long shadows in the lamplight. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, and it carried through the hall with the weight of stone. "They knocked on my door. I opened it. That's all there is." No one moved to stop him as he turned, flour sacks slung over one shoulder, Mary and Samuel at his side. The night air outside was cool, the stars sharp against the dark. The children walked close, steps small but certain, as though the world itself had shifted beneath them. At the edge of town, Mary looked up, her whisper breaking the hush. "We don't have to leave." The rancher paused, his gaze on the horizon where the land stretched endless and quiet. "Not so long as I've breath." Samuel reached up then, small arms lifting, and the rancher bent to gather him. The boy's head rested against his shoulder, light as a promise. Mary held the doll with both button eyes, her face turned toward the sky. They walked homeward beneath the stars, the road long but steadier than it had been, the night alive with the echo of kindness reluctantly remembered. And though the whispers of judgment had not vanished, something deeper had risen in their place, a seed of mercy that no scorn could erase. Which city are you watching our video from? Please leave a comment. Please subscribe to the channel as well. Thank you.